My parents said I needed to pay rent. So I treated the house like an Airbnb, and they hated it. If they want me to pay to live here, then I'll act like a guest. Not my fault if they didn't like the idea. I'm 25 and still live with my parents. Not because I have to, but because it's more convenient. Rent is ridiculously expensive, and I prefer to save my money for more important things: travel, shopping, going out with friends. I've lived here my whole life, so I never saw an issue. I always thought the dynamic was simple: they take care of the house, and I take care of my own life. Until, suddenly, they decided to change the rules. Last week, my dad called me in for an important conversation. My mom was sitting next to him, arms crossed, with that serious expression she makes when she's about to say something I won't like. "We think it's time for you to start contributing financially to the house," my dad started. I laughed. "What? You have a stable job, you make your own money, and you live here without paying anything," he continued. "You want me to pay rent to live in the house where I grew up?" My mom sighed. "It's not about paying rent, it's about helping with the expenses. Bills have gone up, and you're an adult now. It doesn't make sense for you to keep living here for free." With every sentence they spoke, my indignation only grew. "But I already pay for my own things," I argued. "My phone, my clothes, my outings. I don't ask you for anything." "Yes, but who pays for the electricity you use? The internet? The food you eat?" I went silent. "Look, we're not kicking you out," my dad said, trying to sound reasonable. "But either you start contributing, or maybe it's time to find a place of your own." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own parents were trying to charge me for living in my own house. If that's how it was going to be, then I was going to show them what it's like to have a paying guest. And so it began. The next morning, I decided that if I was now a tenant, then my parents were just the property owners. Nothing more, nothing less. I went down to the kitchen like I always did, but instead of grabbing coffee and sitting down to eat, I stopped at the door and looked at my mom. "Good morning. Where's the breakfast that's included with the rent?" She stopped stirring the frying pan and looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What? You know, like continental breakfast? Or is it self-service?" I flashed a polite smile. "Just trying to understand how this place operates." My mom let out an ironic laugh. "Funny. I thought a 25-year-old adult knew how to make their own coffee." I raised my hands, as if avoiding conflict. "Wow, I was just asking. I'll note this in my stay feedback." My dad, who was reading the newspaper at the table, sighed and shook his head. I could already tell he was at his limit, and that only made me want to continue. So, I started acting like a full-time guest. Before, I used to help out occasionally, doing the dishes, sweeping the floor, taking out the trash. Nothing major, but it was part of the household routine. Now? Not my problem. If I was paying to live there, then chores were no longer my responsibility. That night, after dinner, my mom started clearing the table as usual. But when I finished eating, I simply pushed my plate aside and grabbed my phone. She looked at me. "Aren't you going to help?" I put on my best confused face. "Wait, but I'm paying rent now, right? I thought cleaning service was included." She huffed. "So now you're refusing to help just to prove a point?" I shrugged. "Just following the logic of a paying resident." She let out a heavy sigh and took the dishes to the sink, shooting me a glare before leaving the kitchen. Score one for me. Before, my parents liked to have a general idea of where I was. Nothing crazy, but if I was coming home late, I'd text my mom so she wouldn't worry. But now? No more updates. I left on Friday without saying a word and didn't come back until Sunday afternoon. When I walked in, my mom was sitting on the couch, clearly waiting for me. My dad sat next to her, arms crossed. "Where were you?" she demanded, standing up. I feigned surprise. "Oh, hi to you too." She ignored that. "We were worried. You disappeared all weekend." I rolled my eyes. "You don't need to know where I go. I'm just a tenant here, remember?" My dad stood up, irritated. "You're acting like a child." No, I'm acting like an adult paying to live somewhere. You're the ones who wanted this." My mom rubbed her temples, as if trying to hold back. My dad closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. That's when I realized they were really at their limit. And honestly, that just made me want to keep going. But then, they started playing my game. And that's when everything fell apart. At first, I thought they'd given first. My dad constantly complained about my behavior, my mom sighed every time I ignored a house rule, and I was sure it was only a matter of time before they abandoned this ridiculous idea of charging me rent. But then, something changed. They stopped complaining. At first, every sarcastic comment I made about being a paying guest made my dad sigh and my mom roll her eyes. But by the second week, instead of getting mad, they simply started treating me like I really was just a tenant. If I didn't want to help with anything? Fine, they stopped asking. If I wanted to act like the house wasn't mine? They started treating me like a stranger. At first, I loved it. No one asked me to do anything. Dinner was made? Cool. If I wanted to eat, great. If not, no one asked. The problem was when this started affecting things I actually cared about. One day, I got home from work and went to shower. I turned on the water, and it was freezing. At first, I thought the heater had broken, but when I came out wrapped in a towel and asked my mom, she casually responded, "Oh, we turned it off to save money. We only use it for those who help pay the bills." I thought she was joking. She wasn't. The next day, I tried to do laundry, but the machine was locked. I asked my dad, and he answered without even looking at me. "Oh, I figured you'd take your clothes to a laundromat, since you're paying rent and all." They were taking it more seriously than I expected. And the worst part? They were winning. Eventually, I realized they were right. My pride took a hit, but it was fair. I ended up contributing to the household, not as a tenant, but as an adult daughter who finally understood that independence isn't just about paying for my own outings and shopping. And you know what? It stung a little, but it was the right thing to do. Was I too immature, or would you have reacted the same way?